Okay, was in confusion. And he, the centurion, he at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. And then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he inquired who he was and what he had done. And some of the crowd shouted one thing and some shouted another. And he ordered him to be brought up to the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him!" And as Paul was about to be brought out of the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something?" And he said, "Are you not the Egyptian?" And so he did not realize that Paul was a Hebrew, and there had been an Egyptian who was a revolter, and he'd come in with these special kind of swords, and there was murder and all of those sorts of things, and they were called the assassins, and he thought that's who he was. And Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a city of no obscure size, and I beg you permit me to speak to these people." And it says, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was a great hush, he addressed them, and he addressed them in Hebrew. And that's the first time that they realized this was a Hebrew that was speaking to them. And he's going to relate the story that we had found in the book of Acts, chapter 9, and that's whenever he's on his way to Damascus. But with each time that he relates the story, he gives us more information that Luke did not record in the first part. So in this, he says to the Hebrews, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they were very quiet. Now I'm going to drop down from there to, I think it's verse 6. And as I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And I answered, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And that's information that we don't know in in Acts chapter 9. Here it says that they could hear a voice, but they could not understand the enunciations. It was just a roar. So they also saw the light, and then they just heard a roar, but they couldn't understand specifically his pronunciation. And I said, "What shall I do, Lord?" And the Lord said to me, "Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do." And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by hand by those who were with me, and they came to Damascus. And one named Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of, came to me and said to me, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And at the very hour I received my sight and saw him, and he said, "The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you wait? Rise and be baptized." And in verse 17, and when I had returned to Jerusalem and I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. And there, in that trance, I heard the Lord saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." And I said, "Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him." And he said, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." So I'm going to stop there because this part of time is 20 years after that first initial part of when he was on the road to Damascus. 20 years for this to happen. And so I want to make sure that you know that at one part it says here that Paul was in Damascus, and then he was sent back from Jerusalem. He goes back to Saudi Arabia. And you know where you're going to find that is Galatians chapter 1, verse 16. And I think you want to look that one up. So Galatians chapter 1 and verse 16. So we have here that Paul is in Damascus, and then he leaves and he goes, and I may pull that up, Galatians 1 and verse 16. And I'll read from this. I'm sure that you've heard the story of my earlier life when I lived in the Jewish way. In those days, I went out and in persecuting God's church, I was systematically destroying it. I was so enthusiastic about the traditions of my ancestors that I advanced head and shoulders above my peers in my career. Even then, God had designs on me. Why? When I was still in my mother's womb, he chose and called me out of sheer generosity. And now he has intervened and revealed his son to me so that I might joyfully tell non-Jews about him. And immediately after my calling, without consulting anyone around me and without going up to Jerusalem to confer with those who were apostles, long before I got away to Arabia. He went to Saudi Arabia, and he was there for 3 years before I went up to Jerusalem to compare stories with Rome. So I want you to see that with Paul's travels, he goes into Saudi Arabia for 3 years. And from there, it's just him and God. And that's when God gave him the number of revelations that he had about the new church, about the church age that was coming, that was a brand new thing for them. And then Paul goes from Arabia, he goes back to Damascus. And in Damascus, there is another riot that breaks out, and Paul is let down out of a window in a basket in Damascus. And from there, he goes to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the church at Jerusalem, sends him back to Tarsus of Cilicia for 7 years. And so for the first 10 years after Paul's calling, he does nothing but is taught by God. He's not even taught by the apostles. So for 10 years, this great apostle has to be quiet and listen to what God has to say. And so I just want to make sure that we know that sometimes the people that we are praying for and that we are witnessing to, you may not see God see a huge work right away. But it took even the Apostle Paul, after his conversion, 10 years before he was ready to be what we know as Paul the missionary. And so that time being taught and that time of learning is not wasted time. And also then with this man who was this great apostle, he said from his birth he felt like he was called to do this. And the person who tells him first is Ananias. Ananias just goes, and he didn't want to go, but he just spoke what God had told him to speak to this one man. And with us, God gives us that same opportunity. He never sends an angel to tell people about salvation, because angels can never share in the salvation that Christ made for people. Only people can tell people about salvation. And I myself have to remind myself that each day, it may not be a big thing that you're saying, but God brings people into your life just like Paul was brought into the life of Ananias. And whatever you may say may be exactly what God is working in their hearts and in their lives. And so we have that from Damascus, he goes back to Cilicia and Tarsus. And so for 10 years, he is being prepared. And from there, he goes to Antioch. And the church in Antioch, and remember there are 2 Antiochs that are in the scripture. There's actually 6 of them that were in Middle Asia. But Paul's church was Antioch in Syria. And so he goes back to that church in Antioch and goes from there on his journeys. So I'm going to go back and we'll see what else we have to say here. All right, and so we have that whenever he is talking to the Romans, and he says to the Jews, and he says that he tells to them, "For I will send you far away to the Gentiles." And up to this point they had listened, but then they raised their voices, and they were so furious, and they were shouting and screaming and throwing things. And the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And remember, last week I showed you that the Antonio barracks are right next to where the temple was. It overlooked the temple, and that's why Herod the Great had it built there. So the Antonia fortress was where they took him. And once he was in the fortress, it says here in 25, they stretched him out for beating him, for whipping him. And that's when Paul says to the centurion, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned? And when the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and he said, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen. And the tribune came to him and he said, you tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he's asking him that because it was such an elite thing to be born a true Roman, that if you said you were a Roman and you were not, you were executed. So that's why he says to him, are you born? And he said, yes. And the tribune said, I bought my citizenship, which you could do. You could buy your citizenship for enough money, by a large sum. But Paul said, I am a citizen by birth. For those who were about to examine him withdrew immediately, and the tribune was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him, and he also could be executed for binding a Roman citizen without a trial. And that's why all of these men stopped dead in their tracks, because Paul, this is the one time whenever he does not use his Jewish things. He talked to the Jews and he spoke about the Old Testament, but with the Romans, he was a Roman and he spoke to them as a Roman. And on the next day, there was so much commotion that the tribune, what he'd said was, I'm going to bring him out of this meeting place at the temple. You people that are the Jews, you come to the Antonia fortress and we'll interview everyone there. And so they do. So at this next part, when it says, but on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priest and the council to meet with him at the Antonia fortress, and he brought Paul down and sat before them. And it says here that Paul intently looked at the council and said, brothers. He said, brothers. Whenever Peter talked to the Sanhedrin, he called them elders and he called them fathers. But notice that Paul doesn't do that. And he calls them brothers because Paul had at one time been in the Sanhedrin. And so they were his peers. And that's how he addresses them. He had known them and they had known him and been acquainted with him. So once more, he addresses them with the Romans. He was Roman. Here he is brothers and peers, and they are equal. And so he does all of this. Now, it says that the high priest Ananias commanded those that stood by him to strike him. Now, this Ananias, it's like they couldn't think of different names. Everybody's name was John, Peter, and Paul, and Ananias. So you have Ananias and Sapphira, and you have Ananias, who was the guy that was with Jesus. He was the high priest, and Caiaphas, who were his father-in-law. And so this is a different Ananias. And this Ananias is actually recorded by Josephus. Josephus, remember, was born in 37 AD, and he did tend to exaggerate his numbers, but most of the time he gave a pretty good description. And Ananias was, he is real bad. I'm trying to think, don't want to make anything political, don't want to cut anything there, but he is real bad. He was like our Speaker of the House, perhaps. He was sort of like our Speaker of the Senate, perhaps, like that. But what he did was the Jews had to bring offerings into the temple, and they were required offerings and they were free will offerings, and that was dispensed for the upkeep of all the other priests, and also to do any kind of repairs and upkeep of the temple. Well, Ananias had made a deal with the governor who were going to meet, and in order to keep these people of the Jews under their thumb, Ananias said, I can do that, but I would like to have access to the box in the back. And they said, the box in the back is yours. So Ananias took everybody's paycheck. That's right. Ananias became a very wealthy man because all of the free will offerings and all of the tithes, they went into his pocket. So he was despised by everybody and used by the Romans, and the Romans also used him because the Jews were hard to keep under control. And if you lost control of the Jews, you lost your job. So let's go to the next man. So they do all of that. And we find here that Paul he was there. Whenever they smacked him, he thought, I can't win this thing. And so being a good, smart man, God gave him direction of what to do.
I thought Ananias was
I thought, is he saying amen? Is he saying amen? And so with this, Paul starts shouting between these two people, I am a Pharisee. I am a Pharisee. He didn't even try to explain anything to them. He thought this is pointless. And whenever he did that, because these were his cronies, he knew these people. He knew the larger part of that group were Sadducees. And whenever he said, I am a Pharisee, those few that were Pharisees, which meant they believed in the resurrection and they believed all of the Old Testament. And the Sadducees only believed the Pentateuch. They did not believe any of the prophets, minor or major, any of the Psalms, Proverbs, nothing. They believed only the Torah, and they did not believe in the resurrection. So they were sad, you see. Yeah, that's an old one. Okay, and so from there, he says to them, they just take him apart, and they just get rid of everybody. It says in 9, a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up, and then they sharply contended. And in verse 10, and when the dissension became violent, this tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them and bring him back to the barracks. And in verse 11, the following night, the Lord himself stood and said, take courage, but as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, you must testify also in Rome. So once more, he restates that Paul is in his will, and this is to get Paul to the right people in Rome. And so from there, we have that there is a plot for them to, and Paul is sent by this tribune with 200 spearsmen, 200 soldiers, and I think 70 people on horseback, and they take Paul on horseback also, and they take him to Felix the governor, and they take him to the capital of Judea, and that is Caesarea. And that's where the headquarters of all the military is, at Caesarea Maritime on the seacoast there. And then he called together the 200, get ready, and then 70 horsemen and 200 spearsmen, and he delivers them to Felix. And in verse 26, it says his name is Claudius Lysias to his excellency the governor, and he tells them about this man who says he's a Roman soldier, and he says, because I was fearful for his life, I'm delivering them to you. And then on reading the letter, and you find this in verse 34, on reading the letter, Felix, when he asked what province he was from, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, that's Tarsus, he said, I will give you a hearing, and when your accusers arrive, and he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. And so with this, Paul goes before Felix at Caesarea, and they have here that the lawyers and the high priest come down to Caesarea, and they tell this man Felix, and it's interesting with the lawyer, so look what the lawyer says. The lawyer says in verse 2, and when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse Paul, saying, since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation. I feel like I'm listening to CNN. I tell you, in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. I thought, I can't believe this. Turn the channel. But to detain you no farther, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. And so none of that was true. None of that was true. And the lawyer didn't care that none of that was true. And they were not there for justice, So there's nothing new with any party or any politician at any time in any nation. That's just the way it was. And then when you go down to verse 10, it says, Paul replied to Felix the governor, and he says, now listen to what Paul says, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. And so he goes to the obvious. He did not flatter him. He did not say what he did was right or wrong. He just said, you've been here over this nation for many years, and therefore you have a lot of experience. So whenever we do that, he does in verse 14, but this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. And so I always take pains to leave and to have a clear conscience toward God and man. And now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. And then he goes down a bit farther, and he says, so that these men ought to be here before you and to make an accusation if I've done anything actually wrong. And he says, and you can obviously see that I have not done an insurrection against Rome. I have not violated any of the scriptures from those Jews that are here. And in verse 22, but Felix, having a rather acute knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. So he orders to the centurions that he should be kept in custody, but have liberty. So he was not thrown into a prison. He was kept in a home. And it would be like whenever you had perhaps a official that was waiting for accommodations, it was the Holiday Inn. You know, it was a bed, it was a bath, it was that. But he was not in a prison chained to anybody. But they did have one soldier with him during this period of time. And after some days, Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish, and sent for Paul, and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. And it says here that he summoned him often because he wanted Paul to make him, to pay him and to bribe him, and that's what Felix did. But though he kept, and it says in 27, and when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desired to do the Jews a favor. He left Felix left Paul in prison. Now, Felix is a man that's talked about often by Josephus, and I can hardly tell you. He was bad. He was real bad. He was rotten to the core. Felix had been indeed a governor for a long time, just like the lawyer had said. But Felix and his brother were Greek slaves, and they were brilliant, Josephus says, especially Felix. And Felix was able to kind of create his own Greek mafia. And with that, he got enough money that he could buy his citizenship from Rome. And with that citizenship, Judea was something that he could slide into. And so it wasn't huge, but it would be a good spring point for Felix to go farther. So Felix gets the Jews, and he says, I'll let you have access to the tax money if you keep everybody calm and keep this in control, and I'll be governor and we'll work together. So Felix was terribly corrupt. And there was always problems because whenever the head person is corrupt, don't you know that there are people that are lawbreakers? And like we have them in Portland. We have lawbreakers in Philadelphia because if the police are drawn back, evil will always come forth. It doesn't matter who is in office. If you take away the police, you're allowing evil, and evil will always rise to the surface. So knowing that, that's what was happening with Felix. And then I want you to know here, it says that Felix, he had brought in Drusilla, and that's in 24. Drusilla, this is one of those things, whenever I had gone over the people that we had from the genealogy of Herod the Great. Let me see, I may not have this down here. She was a granddaughter of here. There it is. And so this is Drusilla. Are you able to see that? Okay. This is Drusilla. She was married to Felix. And Josephus said that she was so beautiful that as soon as Felix saw her, he fell mad in love with her. And he said, I have to have that girl. And so he married Drusilla. And Drusilla's father was Herod Agrippa the first. He was the one that killed James. He was the one that was eaten by worms. So that is her father. And so that would make Herod the Great her great-grandfather. From Herod the Great, he had Herod Agrippa. He had 3 children. He had Herod Agrippa II, which we're going to see, and he had Berenice, and he had Drusilla. Drusilla is married to Felix, and Berenice, her father, Herod Agrippa, had her marry his brother, Herod of Chalcis. So Bernice was married to him. He only rules a couple of years, and he dies. But whenever he dies, Bernice gets his title. So she gets his title and she gets his money. So she goes back and she lives at home. She lives at home with Herod Agrippa. Now it said, Josephus said that Bernice was probably the most beautiful girl, the most beautiful woman in all of that area. He says she was much loved and often married. And so she did marry her uncle. And then she did marry a couple, at least one other man that she was married to. And she was with him for a few years, and then she divorced him, and she goes back to Herod Agrippa. And what Rome understood, but even Rome did not approve of, is that it was an incestuous affair between Berenice and Herod Agrippa II. So, like I said, and these are the people that God sends Paul to speak to. And so whenever we have an opportunity to speak before any government, Paul, what did he speak up to these people? What exactly he would have talked to the individual? And that was he talked to them about righteousness and about self-control and of the coming judgment. And it frightened Felix. And Felix was so corrupt that he was there for 2 years. He kept Paul in prison, and Paul was not. He was kept in house arrest. I should say that, but he was there. And let's see if here. It's like that. That's Caesarea. So even though he was kept in prison, he had a Mediterranean, room. So he had that going for him, but he was there during that period of time, and he was there for 2 years. And then in chapter 25, it says, now 3 days after Festus had arrived in Provence, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the reason that Felix was demoted, he was so bad that even Nero was the person who demoted him. Even Nero. So he was so bad that even Nero said, oh no, you're too crooked, I can't even take care of you. So he was demoted and he left, and Drusilla apparently stayed with him. And during that, Festus was one of the most brilliant people, according to Josephus, and an excellent communicator and an excellent governor. And he came in with goodness and righteousness and justice. He came in with all of those things, Festus did. But Festus was there for only 2 years. And Festus, they had great hopes for him, but he died unexpectedly. And Josephus never explains what happened, but it was some a quick death, some sort of immediate accident or illness, and Festus dies. So he's not there for long, but let's just see what he says. And Festus, when he arrived there, he also kept them. And Paul, in verse 8, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. And to the Jews I have done no wrong. And this is the Sanhedrin that's there with him again. They want him to go back to Jerusalem. And Paul says, I'm not going back to Jerusalem. Even Paul at this point said, that's not God's will for me. And so he said, no, I'm not going to go back to Jerusalem. I've done nothing wrong, King Festus, and so I appeal to Caesar. And whenever he said that, he had the right as a Roman citizen to go to Caesar, but they had nothing to write down for what his offenses were. And so at this point, this is when King Agrippa and Bernice come in, and you find that in 13. Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeting Festus, and they go in, and Festus also says, I've got to have something to write down. And so in verse 23, on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice come with great pomp, and they enter the audience hall, and the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. And then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought. And Festus says, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me both in Jerusalem and here, shouting he ought not to live. But I have found that he has done nothing worth deserving death. And he decided to appeal to the emperor, but I have nothing definite to write about him. And he says, and therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges brought against him. And Agrippa said, you have permission to speak for yourself. And Paul stretched out his hand and said in his defense. We'll find it next week. But that's a good point to go. And the reason he said, I know that you, King Agrippa, have much to say is because they considered King Agrippa and King Agrippa the First Jewish because of Herod the Great. He was actually from Esau. Herod the Great was not Jewish, but his descendants were Esau, but he was familiar with all of the Jews. And that's why they said, we believe you have the best expertise to be able to interview this man. So next week we'll just see what he has there. And we're going to get on a ship and we're going to go to the Mediterranean. I can hardly wait. Heavenly Father, we ask your blessings upon us as we dismiss, and we thank you and love you. We ask your blessings. Amen.